She waited for his change and lost herself in the process. I still remember the version of myself I was before loving him became my full-time occupation. I was lighter then, not happier in a loud way, but present. I laughed without checking my phone. I spoke without rehearsing. I didn't measure my worth by how someone else treated me. I didn't know that love, when stretched too long in waiting, can quietly erase the person doing the waiting. When I met him, he wasn't cruel. That's what made everything harder to understand later. He was charming in small doses, distant in ways that felt temporary. I told myself everyone has flaws. I told myself patience is love. I told myself change takes time. So I stayed. I stayed when he forgot to reply but stayed active online. I stayed when my messages were read and answered hours later with one-word responses. I stayed when conversations became updates instead of connection. I stayed when my presence started to feel optional. At night, the room would fill with silence. Rain tapping softly against the window, the glow of his phone lighting up his face while I lay beside him staring at the ceiling. Sometimes I'd turn toward him, hoping he'd notice, hoping he'd ask what was wrong. He never did, and I never said anything. I didn't want to be another problem in his already busy life. I learned how to hide pain efficiently. I smiled at the right moments. I laughed when I was expected to. I convinced myself that love meant understanding someone even when they didn't understand you back. I waited for his change like it was a season that would arrive on its own if I was patient enough. The waiting became my identity. Days passed in routine. Nights passed in quiet disappointment. I stopped asking questions because answers rarely came. I stopped sharing feelings because they felt like burdens. I told myself that one day he'd wake up and realize how much I loved him. But people don't wake up to what is always there. He grew comfortable in my loyalty. Comfortable in knowing I would stay. Comfortable in my silence. And comfort, I learned too late, is dangerous when it replaces effort. I remember one night clearly. It was raining heavily. The city outside was blurred, lights melting into the dark. I sat on the floor near the window, phone in my hand, rereading a message I had sent him earlier that day. It was long, honest, carefully written. I told him I felt invisible. I told him I missed him even when he was right beside me. The message said, "Seen." That was all. No reply, no follow-up, just that small word glowing on my screen, heavy enough to crush whatever was left of me. I didn't cry loudly. I didn't scream. I just sat there, quietly, until the rain softened and something inside me went silent. From that night on, I began disappearing slowly. I stopped dressing the way I used to. Stopped doing things that once made me feel like myself. My world shrank to his moods, his availability, his attention. I told myself it was temporary. That love required sacrifice. I didn't realize I was the only one sacrificing anything at all. He noticed the changes too late. By the time he looked up, I was already exhausted. By the time he asked if something was wrong, I didn't know how to explain without breaking down. By the time he promised to do better, I had spent years believing promises instead of actions. The day I finally left wasn't dramatic. There were no accusations, no raised voices, just an empty room and a quiet understanding that love shouldn't feel like constant waiting. He stood there, confused, asking when things went so wrong. I didn't have the strength to tell him it happened slowly, while he was busy living his life and I was busy hoping he'd change. Now I sit alone most nights. The silence feels different now. It still hurts, but it's honest. Sometimes my phone lights up, and for a second my heart reacts out of habit. Then I remember who I am without waiting. He reached out months later. Apologies, regret, realization, all the things I once begged for. But by then, I was tired in a way love couldn't fix. Because when you spend too long waiting for someone to change, you don't just lose them, you lose